Hello and welcome. My name is Geoffrey Collier and I run Impress Books, a publisher of quality fiction and non-fiction, as well as I. Lewis Publishing, a publisher of fantasy and science fiction. Today we're talking to author Harriet Springbett about her book coming out next week, Tree Magic, published by Impress Books, and we're joined by fellow author Tracy Waugh. Harriet's childhood on a small farm in West Dorset gave her an early exposure to nature, which continues to inspire her writing. She qualified as an engineer, but during a Raleigh International expedition in Chile, she realized she preferred words to numbers. She abandoned her profession, moved to France, studied French, and then worked as a project manager, feature writer, translator, and TEFL teacher. She now lives in Poitou-Charentes, is that right? Close? Not close. Sorry? Okay, what she said. It's where she lives with her French partner and their teenage children. Since her first literary success, aged 10, her short stories and poetry have been published in literary journals and placed in writing competitions, including a shortlisting in the 2017 Bath Short Story Award. Harriet leads writing workshops and has judged the Segura International Short Story Competition. So welcome, Harriet, and welcome also, Tracy. Lovely to have you.
Thank you.
Your wonderful novel, Tree Magic, is being re-released next week with a gorgeous new cover. And the sequel, Tree Slayer, a little later in the year. And we want to talk about both of those in a bit. But before we do, I'd really like to talk a little bit more about you as a writer, if that's okay. And I guess, first things first in our strange times, how have you been getting on in lockdown?
I've actually been enjoying it, but I must admit, with a house full of teenagers and a partner working from home, my writing hasn't advanced as much as I'd like.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah, fair enough. So I think... Actually, I think a lot of writers are in that situation. How about you, Tracy? Have you found the same thing, or have you been writing a lot?
Slightly different. I'm living on my own, so I feel cut off from my family, who are all in London, and missing them. And I'm also working more or less full time from home. So I'm trying to, write around all the on-screen meetings and other work that I'm doing.
Yeah.
My job.
Okay, so affecting us all very differently. Interesting, thank you for that. So, Harriet, you've been writing since you were age 10, apparently. So when did you decide you wanted to write a novel? Because working in manufacturing engineering is a world away from being an author. And your biography mentions a trip to Chile, which I assume had some kind of inciting incident, as writers might say, to change the direction of your life. I don't know. Tell me a bit about how you came to write novels.
Well, I've always been a bookworm, like a lot of writers. And at school, I think people thought I was going to study English. And so that was enough for me to think, well, I don't want to study English, I want to do something different. And engineering sounded exotic at the time, so I decided to study engineering. The Chile part comes in because I took a year off after my degree at Brunel University, and I was selected to go on an Operation Raleigh expedition to Chile. And you have to raise money in order to do that. And one of the ways I raised money was to write an account of every day on the expedition, and I sold that to people before I went.
Right. Okay.
When I returned, I had to give them my account of the day that they bought.
Yeah.
So that meant that while I was in Chile with the rain every day and up to my knees in mud, I had to write what I was doing each day.
Yeah.
And because it was a year off, I started the year off with Chile, and when I came and continued my year off, I kept writing, in fact, to the despair of the people I was with. And during that year, I also did my first writing course. It was a week course at St Andrews University. And that taught me how to write stories, terrible stories.
Well, it gets you started somewhere, doesn't it?
That's right, yeah. So that's when I started writing stories. But my life seems to have been a kind of running away from being a writer, because when I went back to work at my company after my year off, I decided that I couldn't work in a factory for my whole life. I wanted to be out and about discovering life. And so I thought I might do an MA in creative writing. This was in the early 1990s. But the problem was I had a French boyfriend as well. So I had to decide what to do, and I decided France was more exotic than an MA in creative writing. So I thought I was saying goodbye to my writing when I came to France. I thought that was finished because there was no internet. And in fact, I went to university at Pau to study French, and I was very inspired by my French literature teacher, Martine Fievet, at Pau University. And she encouraged me to write again, even though I was writing in French. And that was even worse than in English. And I entered a competition in a local newspaper, a short story competition, and I won it. I think about 10 people entered. There weren't enough to make it worthwhile. But the important thing is that the judge said to me, if you ever write a novel, I will read it. So I did.
Very good.
And then I wrote another novel, and here we are.
Oh, very good. Yeah, what a lovely story. Running away, you kind of have a bit of a theme of that in Tree Magic, don't you? But we might come on to that a little bit later. So I guess, one thing I wanted to ask is whether you've had any particularly favorite books that you've read over the years, and whether any of those have inspired you in terms of your writing.
Yeah, of course. Probably Ali Smith is one of the biggest influences. I love the originality of her work, particularly her short stories. She writes some brilliant short stories about trees, actually. And John McGregor is another writer who inspires me with his attention to detail. He wrote If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things, which had a big impact on me. I'm a big fan of Kate Atkinson, her early work, behind the scenes at the museum, for example. Again, it's the originality, the quirky writing that I like. Literary fiction, it's definitely my favourite category. I like books that make you think about things.
Yeah. That's quite interesting, actually. I mean, when the first edition of Tree Magic was published, it was categorized as young adult fiction. And I mean, we had a talk about that a few months ago, didn't we? And yes, it is young adult, but it's also so much more than young adult because it has literary qualities to it, and it has, as we'll maybe come on to, some philosophical elements to it, and it's quite a complex story with a lot of depth to it, if that's what you're looking for. So maybe we can go on to that now, and just you can tell us a little bit about Tree Magic and what it's about.
Yeah, so Tree Magic is a story about a teenage girl, Rainbow, who discovers she has a gift for communicating with trees. So this gift, it's somebody who has a gift for playing the piano or who is very good at dance. When you have a gift for something, you have to decide whether you're going to sacrifice a lot of things in order to pursue it, to develop it, or whether you just enjoy it, but not more than that. So this is what Rainbow's situation is in Tree Magic. And she comes from a dysfunctional family, and she's not aided by the fact that this gift that she has is not a life-changing gift. So she could easily forget about it. So that's what it's about. And the fact that it's spiritual, I think that's, it's interesting because she has to decide what to do about this spiritual gift in a society, today's society, which is very much based on science. So that was an personal interest for me, a theme that interested me in writing about it.
Yeah, that's Yeah, but that comes to fore quite early on in the book, doesn't it? With her stepfather insisting on measuring things, and there's some good tension there quite early in relation to that. So yeah, interesting. And Rainbow starts off the story age 13. She finishes at age 18, and that's obviously, there's a huge difference between a 13-year-old and an 18-year-old, and the perspectives, the outlook they have on life. So I'm interested in how you found writing some in that very, dynamic period of a teenager's life, really, the different perspectives that and outlooks that she might have had across those years, all in the same book.
Yeah, well, actually, that's not something I really thought about a lot when I was writing. You know, in any novel, the characters have to develop, otherwise there's no interest in the story. And I guess growing up is just a way of developing. The fact I have children of my own probably helped, and also it probably took me 2 years to write Tree Magic, another year to edit it afterwards. So I was seeing the same change in my own children. Yeah. At the same time, but it wasn't consciously something I thought about. It just kind of happened. Really.
Happens, right? Okay. Well, that's interesting to know. I mean, there's as I indicated earlier, I mean, I found Tree Magic really fascinating just because there was a lot of different themes to explore there. So tell us a little bit about some of those that you were thinking about, or that you've since noticed. Because sometimes as a writer, you write things and then go back to it and go, oh, I didn't realize I was writing about that.
Yeah, I think that happens a lot, actually. And I certainly thought I was writing just about the things that science can't explain. The fact that there are things in life that can't be explained by science. That was what I was interested in. Yeah. And I discovered in hindsight that actually the Tree Magic and Tree Slayer are all about faith. And I don't mean faith in God, although that is addressed in Tree Slayer. It's also about faith in life, having faith in life, and having faith in yourself. And that's a theme, probably one of the main themes that's carried through the whole way. But of course, there's always also the theme of being different. And Rainbow, because she's different, what do you do when you're very different to everybody else? Yeah. And I guess that's a nationality thing as well. People who live in a different country, like Tracy, for example, and how we
in fact. I'm Australian. I'm Australian, believe it or not. Not that you tell from my accent, but there we go. Sorry, carry on. I disrupted your flow. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. So those are the major themes, I guess. And of course, there are minor themes like finding the importance of the father figure and the idea of lies and why we tell lies as well. That's another theme. And of course, the theme of trees and the environment. And that's a theme that isn't actually prevalent in Tree Magic, but it does come much more into play in the sequel in Tree Slayer.
It does. Yeah, it does, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to follow up on the sort of the being different theme that you were talking about, because I mean, one thing that I found really interesting is that I mean, without wanting to give, I obviously don't want to give too much away for people who haven't read it, but there's an incident that happens where fairly early on in the book, which is traumatic for Rainbow, and this is where the parallel worlds first come into play. And she splits into two different people in these two different, well, it's kind of the same world, not really parallel worlds. It's really interesting, and that's why I often say it's a philosophical book. But the two of them take very, very different paths from there on, and the only difference between them, the only thing that separated why one of them took one path and the other took another path, was a piece of knowledge that one of them had and the other one didn't. And I found that really fascinating in terms of both our own journeys through life, how much, you know, in terms of how much do events around shape us versus our own choices, and also in terms of our tendency to judge other people based on what we see, not understanding that they have a major backstory behind them and why they've become the way they have. And I don't know, I guess I just like your, I mean, I found that really interesting. So I don't know if you have anything to say on that. Or Tracy, you've been very quiet so far, sitting there in the background, eating on your virtual cup of, eating your virtual plate of cake, which we don't have with us. We do have drinks. We all have drinks with us. Excellent. Yeah. So, do you have any thoughts? Any thoughts on that? Either of you?
Tracy?
Well, yeah, I did have something I wanted to ask you. You know, coming out from Jeff's questions and your answers, I'm interested in this movement from non-fiction to fiction, and you know what fiction can do that non-fiction perhaps can't do, because you talked about how you started out, you know, writing about Chile, and I think that's quite a common process for novelists, that they'll maybe start writing memoir or journaling and then move into writing stories, which is quite different. And I suppose I'm thinking about, you know, contemporary ecological concerns and climate change, and you know how you can write about things like that without being didactic in fiction. Perhaps, I don't know, is that relevant to how you see what you're doing?
That's interesting, because it's always tempting to get on your I can't remember what we say, and it's always
hobby horse. Yeah,
that's the one, hobby horse. Yeah, it's always tempting to get on your hobby horse and teach, but it's also a challenge not to do that, to put your point across without actually saying it. And that's something you try and do whenever you're writing, particularly in short stories. They always say, show and don't tell. And in fact, that's what it's about. It's not telling something, but actually showing it so that the reader understands without you telling them. And I guess that's what the fiction side of it is for me. So I've done quite a lot of work on research, rather, on the recent studies in tree communication and the way they work together. And so starting from that kind of scientific base, I then tried to imagine, well, what if, and perhaps a little bit in the idea of you have the scientific base and then you have the spiritual, or the part we don't know, the part that science can't explain yet. And fiction allows you to explore that in a completely free way. And that's what I love about fiction, is that you can just make everything up.
Yes.
Great.
I must admit, that's what I love about fiction. And I mean, I've written a little bit, just written some fantasy is what I like to write. And I love it because everything that you make up can be a metaphor for something. And it's just such a communicative way of writing, if that makes sense. Yeah, anyway, so I totally get that. Yeah, very good.
Coming back to the decision side, we've all made a decision and then wondered what would have happened if we hadn't taken that choice. And I think that's what I was exploring with these two versions of Rainbow. And I was actually quite shocked too to see how different their lives become. I wasn't really expecting that. I wasn't sure where they were going to go, but I certainly wasn't expecting what did happen.
Yeah, they do have a life of their own, don't they, our characters? So if they'd only just do what they're told, but anyway, they don't, and that's the way of things, isn't it? So the second book in the series, Tree Slayer, is set a couple of years after the end of Tree Magic. And so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, in fact, it's set 9 months after Tree Magic. It's not even a couple of years.
Oh, okay.
So
Sorry,
So
my mismemory. Yep.
Okay. I think what you need to understand with Tree Magic and Tree Slayer in the series is that, in fact, they're parts of the same story. So what we've got is a kind of arc that goes from Tree Magic and the ordinary world, which goes right through to the magical side. So as you read through the series, the books become more and more magical. So yeah, that's a magical element. If you look at Tree Magic, for example, that's where Rainbow discovers her gift and she has to make decisions about what to do with it. And we're just introduced to the idea of parallel worlds. And then when we get into Tree Slayer, she actually has to deal with the consequences of what happens at the end of Tree Magic.
Yeah.
So that's how that fits together. So Tree Slayer, she goes on a quest to find some answers, and she learns about trees along the way, a lot more about trees and tree communications, and herself, of course. She learns a lot about herself along the way. And of course, we have that other lovely character, Eol, who makes an appearance. So Eol is a boy, an 18-year-old boy who lives in the Pyrenees Mountains. And yeah, go on, Jeff. Did you?
No, I was just going to say, I love Eol, and I know you want to be a bit careful about this because you don't want to come across as an expert or anything. But I have an 18-year-old son who is autistic, and I see a lot of parallels between Eol and my son. And you haven't explicitly said that he's autistic in the book at all, but I found that interesting, and just wonder how you created that character, where he came from.
That's the question. Where do our characters come from? Yeah. So with Eol, I didn't deliberately want to make him autistic. It wasn't a choice. I started with him and his powers because he has particular powers. And I guess I just imagined how those powers would shape him and what he would become. And I don't like putting labels on people. So Eol to me is just Eol. He has his own specific reactions. He reacts in his own way to what happens, like any character does, in fact.
Yeah, he's a wonderful character. I love him. Can I ask
a question, Jeff, or are you following up there?
Yeah.
You mentioned the Pyrenees, Harriet, and I'm wondering about the influences of living in France on your writing. You mentioned the idea of being different, but I wondered if landscapes and researching there was an influence on how you write and what you write.
Yeah, France definitely has an influence on me, simply because if I lived in England, I don't think I would be a writer. Because when I'm in France, writing in English keeps me in contact with my origins. It's like a link to England. And when I go back to England and I go into a bookshop and there are all these English books, brilliant stories all around me, I think, well, what's the point? What can I add to that? What's the point in writing? And it's only when I come back to France again that I think, oh yes, I fancy writing a bit more. That's it. So I think it's part of keeping in touch with your origins. I do feel a bit like a hybrid, actually. I feel as if I'm not really English anymore, and I'm not French either. And I think perhaps you can relate with that, Tracy, that you're neither one nor the other.
Yes.
But, yeah.
The
Pyrenees.
I don't really believe that there is one or the other either, but that's another story.
Yeah, perhaps. And the Pyrenees actually were really important to me for Tree Slayer because I was invited on a writing residency there at the Maison des Arts in Arras-en-Lavedon in the Val d'Azun. And that's where I wrote about Eol. So I was out in the mountains imagining Eol there as well. And that was really key. So I love the mountains.
Fair enough. They have their own unique beauty, mountains and different continents, as I'm sure your time in South America also showed you. So we're kind of probably running out of time a bit, so I guess I just want to move on a bit and just ask about any future writing. So you have another book in the series to come out after Tree Slayer. And is there anything, so you could tell us a bit about that, and is there anything else that you have in mind for the future?
Yeah, so the third book in the series, probably the final book, but the third book in any case, is called Tree Sacrifice at the moment. And so that plays a lot more, that goes into more depth in the parallel world idea, the idea of parallel worlds, but it's on a much bigger scale than tree magic, for example. This is why I talk about it being part of the same story, because you go from small to big scale, in fact.
Yeah.
So it's going through the editing stage at the moment, which is a bit scary, the structural edit. So I don't know what my editor's going to think about it. We shall see.
That's always a bit terrifying, isn't it? When you get back the editor's comments and you think, and you say, oh, thank you, that's really helpful. And inside you're going, oh no, they hate my book.
Yeah, I think I need about 3 days to come to terms with criticism, any kind of critique, whether it's a short story critique or a structure, an edit critique.
Yeah.
First of all, I'm thinking, no, that's not right. No. And then the next day I'm thinking, well, maybe, but no. And then the third day I'm thinking, well, yeah, actually, he's right. She's right. Do you get that, Tracy?
Yeah, that's very sympathetic. Yeah. Is there time for one more question, Jeff?
Yes, there's time for one more question. Go ahead, Tracy.
It was about your early start as an engineer and shift to writing novels. Also really intriguing, and it makes me think about the painter William Blake complaining about Newton measuring a rainbow. That kind of opposed idea of science and art, I suppose. And I wondered, how you see yourself using that in your writing, and whether you see anything positive about the engineer in you.
Yeah, good question. Actually, I think I had to relearn how to write after my 4 years of engineering studies, because it's just such a completely different way of writing. It's very analytical, very factual, what you write in the engineering world. And so I had to relearn everything. I can't honestly see any way at all that it has helped my writing, except that I'm not scared to write about technical things. I had to read some very technical papers scientific papers about parallel worlds, multiverses and things. And so perhaps some of the scientific bases came in useful for that. But other than that,
we use everything one way or another, don't we?
We do, yeah, that's true. Yeah, in fact, I met the author Jane Leifel at Shrew Literary Festival, like you, Tracy, and she said to me, well, with your engineering background, aren't you going to write a novel about engineering? And I was very surprised, because I thought, well, there's nothing interesting in engineering, it's just engineering. But maybe something will come out later with that, maybe a novel later.
Oh, there's always an interesting novel to write on any topic. I'm a firm believer of that. Okay, well, I think that probably wraps up our time for today. So, as you say, we have Tree Slayer coming out a bit later this year, and Tree Sacrifice, as you said, working title, which we don't have a release date for yet, but probably early next year. And Tree Magic, by the time this goes out, Tree Magic will be available, the second edition, on ebook. The paperback will be available within the next month or so. So thank you very much for your time, Harriet. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
I've actually got a blog, Harriet Springbett, WordPress whatever.
Okay.
I think. So so I do blog about writing and about life in France, cultural events in France, that kind of thing. So people can contact me through my blog, Harriet Springbett.
Okay. Lovely. Okay, so, well, thank you again for your time, Harriet, and for yours, Tracy. Best of luck, not just for the re-release of Tree Magic, but almost more importantly, really, for the release of the sequels coming up later this year and early next year. And thank you to anyone who has taken the time to listen to us today or watch us today. We hope you've been inspired by Harriet. And if you'd like to check out Tree Magic, the ebook is available now on all of the main ebook retailers. Stay safe, everyone, and happy reading.